A blessed good morning. You know that Jehovah's Witnesses like to use this verse in Mark 13, verse 32, to argue that Jesus isn't God. But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. And so the argument is God knows everything. So therefore, if Jesus doesn't know the day and the hour, if there's something Jesus doesn't know, how can he be God when God is supposed to be omniscient? But this is a very hypocritical argument for the Jehovah's Witnesses to make. Let's go to their very website, jw.org, their official website. Let's go there. And you scroll right down to the bottom, and you're going to see why I say that the Jehovah's Witnesses are being hypocritical when they say this, okay? So we're going to go here to their books, and there's a book called Insight. The third one, you see Bibles, then glossary, then Insight. You click on Insight. And then you're going to go, everything is in alphabetical order, so you're going to go to the letter F. And when you hit that letter F, you're going to look for the word foreknowledge, because there's a section in their book that talks about God's foreknowledge, about Jehovah's ability to know the future. So you have foreknowledge and foreordination, and you can scroll right down, and you're going to notice something very interesting about what the Jehovah's Witnesses say here. Notice this portion that says selective exercise of foreknowledge. Selective exercise of foreknowledge. And it says here, the alternative to predestinarianism, the selective or discretionary exercise of God's powers of foreknowledge, would have to harmonize with God's own righteous standards and be consistent with what he reveals of himself in his word. In contrast with the theory of predestinarianism, a number of texts point to an examination by God of a situation then current, and a decision made on the basis of such examination. Thus, at Genesis 11 verse 5 to 8, God is described as directing his attention earthward, surveying the situation at Babel, and at that time determining the action to be taken to break up the unrighteous project there. After wickedness developed at Sodom and Gomorrah, Jehovah advised Abraham of his decision to investigate by means of his angels to see whether they act altogether according to the outcry over it that has come to me, and if not, I can get to know it. God spoke of becoming acquainted with Abraham. And after Abraham went to the point of attempting to sacrifice Isaac, Jehovah said, "For now I do know that you are God-fearing, in that you have not withheld your son, your only one, from me." Selective foreknowledge means that God could choose not to foreknow indiscriminately all the future acts of his creatures. So they are claiming that God doesn't actually know everything in the future. This would mean that rather than all history from creation onward bearing a mere rerun of what had already been foreseen and foreordained, God could with all sincerity set before the first human pair the prospect of everlasting life in an earth free from wickedness. His instructions to his first human son and daughter to act as his perfect and sinless agents in filling the earth with their offspring and making it a paradise, as well as exercising control over the animal creation, could thus be expressed as the grant of a truly loving privilege and as his genuine desire towards them, not merely as giving of a commission that, on their part, was foredoomed to failure. God's arranging for a test by means of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad and his creation of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden also would not be meaningless or cynical acts, made so by his foreknowing that the human pair would sin and never be able to eat of the tree of life. To offer something very desirable to another person on conditions known beforehand to be unreachable is recognized as both hypocritical and cruel. So the entire argument that the Jehovah's Witness camp is making here is that Jehovah God does not know everything. There are things in the future that God is ignorant of. He chooses whether or not to know certain future events. So they can't righteously argue, they can't reasonably argue that Jesus isn't God on the basis that he doesn't know something, when there are things that Jehovah God himself doesn't know, and yet they claim he's God. So no, I'm not saying that I think God doesn't know everything. I'm not saying that at all. It is the Jehovah's Witnesses who do not actually believe that God is omniscient. They don't actually believe that Jehovah God knows everything. And therefore, it's very hypocritical of them to make this argument against Jesus being God. Now, if we go to John 16, verse 30, notice what the Bible actually says about Jesus' ability to know the future. It says there, now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. John 16, verse 30 does tell us that Jesus knows all things. Therefore, he is God because God is omniscient. So, in his divinity as God, Jesus does know all things. But in his humanity as a man, obviously, he got hungry, he got tired, and he was limited in knowledge. This same type of statement is repeated again in John chapter 21, where we can read concerning Jesus that again, he knows everything. So if we were to scroll right the way down to verse 17, it says, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. I think Peter, who walked with Jesus, who talked with the man personally, knew him better than modern day Jehovah's Witnesses. So clearly, Jesus does indeed know all things in his divinity as God. And these are passages that the Jehovah's Witnesses obviously would have lots of trouble dealing with. So I'm going to finish here with John chapter 1. I'm going to finish this off with John chapter 1, which tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see who the Word was? The Word was God. Verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Therefore the Word cannot be a created being, because all things, not some things, not most things, but all things were made through him. So even if you argue that he was an agent of creation because it uses the word through, it still separates him from being a part of the all things that was made. The Word was already there before all things in the beginning. Then God the Father created all things through God the Word. So I think that is very significant. And it even goes on to tell us in verse 10 that he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We know that is talking about Jesus Christ. Verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So clearly it is telling us that Jesus is God. Now, is this saying that there are two different gods in John 1, verse 1? Because that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses argue. They argue that, oh, no, the Word was actually another God. So they claim that Jesus is actually another God, which completely and flatly contradicts Isaiah 45 and verse 5, which says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. So we have the clear monotheism of Scripture telling us that there's only one God. So the Father and the Son, they are not two different gods, which is why in John 14 verse 9, Jesus says, he that has seen me has seen the Father, which is why he says in John 10 verse 30, I and my Father are one, which is why Isaiah 9 verse 6 tells us, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So I just wanted to leave that tidbit with you, because clearly the Jehovah's Witnesses have taken things out of context with Mark 13 verse 32. They don't recognize that the incarnation is the reason why Jesus didn't know the day and the hour when God came as a man, when he came in human flesh in John chapter 1, where the word becomes flesh, obviously he is taking on another nature. Therefore, there will be limitations on that human nature, and so he wouldn't know the day and the hour. But then in his divinity, we have the scriptural proof that he knows all things. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are being very hypocritical because they themselves don't believe that Jehovah God knows everything either. So if Jehovah can selectively foreknow certain things and not know other things, why can't Jesus? Why can't Jesus selectively know some things and selectively not know the day and the hour? It just goes to show the bias with which they have approached this subject. So that's my tidbit for today. So when they come knocking on your door and they want to use this argument to argue against the deity of Christ, I think you have a ready answer.